Okay, let's get started. So good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining the 28th Special Dialogue hosted by Global Health Innovation Policy Program at GRIPS. I am Hiromi Murakami, and I have a privilege of facilitating and organizing this dialogue series. We initiated this dialogue in 2020 when we faced the challenges of COVID-19. Now we have broadened our scope to address various issues, including health crisis, economic security, regional security threats, and economic and political disruption, addressed under the theme of Japan's challenge. Today, a global community is ever divided in issues like Gaza, Ukraine, trade politics, governing systems. The world has become much more uncertain. Today, we are honored to welcome Mr. Clyde Prestowitz, who is a leading writer and strategist on globalization and competitiveness. I had the privilege to work with him at the Economic Strategy Institute in Washington, D.C. some years ago. We extend our gratitude to the U.S. Embassy Tokyo for supporting our program. Let me introduce today's speaker, Mr. Clyde Prestowitz. He has lived, studied, and worked in Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the United States, and has written best-selling books including Trading Places, Rogue Nation, 3 Billion New Capitalists, The Betrayal of American Prosperity, and Japan Restored. Clyde was a leader of the first U.S. trade mission to China in 1982 and has served as an advisor to Presidents Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Clinton, and Obama. As counselor to the Secretary of Commerce in the Reagan administration, Mr. Prestowitz headed negotiations with Japan, South Korea, and China. Under the Clinton administration, he served as a vice chairman and the vice chairman of the Presidential Commission on Trade and Investment in the Asia-Pacific region. He had successful corporate marketing career as well, working for such companies like Scott Paper Company Europe in Brussels, Egon Zehnder International in Tokyo, and the American Can Company. He's a graduate of Swarthmore College, the University of Hawaii, Keio University, and Wharton Graduate School of Business. We'll have Dr. Kiyoshi Kurokawa, the director of GHIPP, will be joining as a commentator. With that, I'd like to hand over the microphone to Clyde, and it's all yours. Thank you very much for joining.
Well, thank you, Hiromi-san. It's good to see you and good to be back in Japan in spirit, if not in actual person. Actually, I've been thinking this morning that it has been, I first came to Japan in 1965, so it's been a long time. And what I'm thinking is that since I first came to Japan, we've lived in a world which has been largely dominated by the United States. And we've gone through a series of stages. So when I first came to Japan in 65, Japan was, the Japanese miracle had just been declared. And that represented a stage of internationalization, the beginning of expansion of international trade, free trade, and also, of course, we were in the midst of a Cold War, and we proceeded in the course of the Cold War. Of course, we had the Vietnam War. Henry Kissinger and President Nixon executed what we called the opening to China, and then eventually China was recognized, Communist China was recognized as the proper government of China. And then we went through a period of rapid growth, particularly by Japan and some of the other Asian tigers like South Korea and Taiwan. And there were great debates over industrial policy and free trade and fair trade. But through all of that, the US was the dominant player globally. Of course, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, we entered a period in which people even talked about the end of history, arguing that the end of history is democracy and capitalist economics. On the one hand, the U.S. and its allies, Japan, the EU, and others, worked to try to weave the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, now Russia, into what we called the global system, and also particularly to bring China into the system. I recall particularly, I led the first American trade mission to China in the fall of 1981. And I remember being shocked, just really shocked by the poverty that I saw. I had never seen such a poor place. Just to give you an example, we flew to China in the vice president's airplane, Air Force Two, and drove in from Beijing Airport into downtown Beijing. There was not a vehicle on the road except bicycles. No stoplights in Beijing. The tallest building was 10 stories, the Post and Telegraph building. Everyone was wearing black Mao suits and riding black bicycles. Just a really very poor country. And I had brought with me about 100 American executives who were interested in trying to do business with China. And it was the feeling at the time, this was the Reagan administration. The feeling at the time was that on the one hand, there was concern about China was a communist country, but on the other hand, there was a feeling that if China could be woven into the global trade system and achieve economic growth as Japan had done, as South Korea was doing, that it would effectively become increasingly liberal and perhaps even democratic. That persisted, that sense persisted even in the wake of the Tiananmen Square incident. You all are aware, I'm sure, of the incident in which the Chinese army was called in to put down demonstrations of students demonstrating for democracy and liberty. President George H.W. Bush had succeeded President Reagan. And President George H.W. Bush had been the U.S. ambassador to China before he became vice president and then president. And he was very careful in how he reacted to the Tiananmen Square incident. He sent his national security advisor immediately to Beijing to tell Deng Xiaoping, who had succeeded Mao, that George Bush, would keep the boats from rocking, and that he would have to take measures to discipline China, but remember that he was a friend of China. And so the U.S. and China got over the Tiananmen Square incident, and the United States particularly began to promote investment and doing business with China. President Clinton ran for the presidency on a platform in which he said, no dictators from Baghdad to Beijing. But once he became president, he changed his tune, and he began talking about positive engagement. And positive engagement meant negotiation of more trade agreements, liberalization, opening of the American market to imports from China, and eventually the admission of China to the World Trade Organization. And there was a feeling particularly strong in Washington and in the democratic countries, but particularly strong in Washington, that through free trade and through globalization, China and other formerly communist countries would not only become wealthier and more economically advanced, but they would become less communist, less authoritarian, and more democratic. In fact, President George W. Bush made the statement that free trade inevitably leads to democracy. And I think that we have now reached a stage at which the world is beginning to recognize that that's not the case, that free trade doesn't necessarily lead to democracy, and that it doesn't necessarily lead to peaceful, friendly relationships. I think we've also come to a moment in which the United States is still the most powerful country in the world. I would say overall the strongest country in the world, but it's not nearly as dominant as it was in 1981, 1945, 1981, 2000. Relatively, the U.S. has lost power. And I think that's being particularly demonstrated right now by the conflict in Gaza and Palestine and Israel, in which the U.S. Is, I hate to say this, but effectively, I think the United States is enabling a genocide by Israel, and the U.S. is losing support of much of the free world because of that. That's not the only factor by a long shot, but we've also reached the moment in which we are beginning to talk about de-risking or even decoupling, because what has evolved is a concern that not only has free trade not led China to democracy or to more liberal kind of governance, but it has led China to create an enormously powerful, increasingly powerful military establishment. And because of that concern for national security, the United States, ironically, is adopting an industrial policy. I say ironically because you in Japan, I'm sure many of you remember when the United States kept criticizing Japan for its industrial policy. And I have to admit, I was one of the critics. In the 1980s, I was Counselor to the Secretary of Commerce in the Reagan administration, and I was one of the lead negotiators with Japan on trade issues. And I'm sure many of you remember we had a lot of hot negotiations and hot issues, and the U.S. was always complaining about Japanese industrial policy. Well, now the U.S. has seen the light. Let me make that clear to my Japanese friends in your audience. The U.S. is now pursuing industrial policy, and particularly, ironically, in semiconductors. Many of you, I'm sure, remember the semiconductor wars of the late 1980s and early and 1990s. Well, now the U.S. is subsidizing the construction of new semiconductor fabs in the U.S. And attempting to entice companies like TSMC and others in Japan and in Europe to also produce in the U.S. But my overall point here is that the global system has reached a stage at which the U.S. is no longer completely dominant, in which the power of China has become very great. But not only has China's power become very great, other countries, India is now the world's fourth or fifth largest economy, and other so-called global South economies are also growing rapidly. And so I think we're in a new age. And I think we're in an age in which uh, all of us, but particularly the United States, will have to uh, rethink the institutions that we want, rebuild some of the institutions, rethink the way that we conduct geopolitical operations, rethink the way that we do uh, international trade and economic growth. What do I mean by rethink? Well, for all of my life, and I'm sure for all for all of the life of many of you, the U.S. dollar has been the main reserve currency of the global economy. Today, the U.S. dollar is as I recall, I may be a little bit off, but the U.S. is about 61 or 62% the dollar of international transactions. Now, of course, that's being challenged. China would like the RMB to become more important. The Russians and others are trying to get around the dollar dominance. Uh, but my point is that, ironically, the dollar dominance is not necessarily good for the U.S. It's good in the sense that it empowers the United States to cut off Russia, for example, from use of international financial transaction systems. So the dollar dominance provides the United States quickly with a powerful tool to enforce its policies. But I'm sure many of you, all of you, probably realize that the United States has a chronic current account trade deficit. This year, the U.S. trade deficit will be more than $1 trillion. And so what that means is that the U.S. has to borrow $1 trillion this year and next year and for succeeding years in order to cover its trade deficit. Um, and part of what's going on here is that because the dollar is the main global currency, it also tends to be overvalued. Other countries want to hold dollars. Investors want to hold dollars. And so even though the U.S. is accumulating trade deficits, the power of the dollar is such that investors and corporations and governments want to hold a lot of their reserves and wealth in dollars. So it makes the demand for the dollar very strong, and that strong demand pushes up the price of the dollar. But a high price of the dollar increases the U.S. trade deficit because it prices U.S. products out of the market. And that used to be the case in relatively low technology products, but increasingly it's the case in the highest technology products. And from a point of view of national security, from the point of view of the U.S. as the major player in global maintaining the global security system and the global economic system, and a consistently, chronically overpriced dollar ultimately undermines the underlying pillars of the system. And so I'm thinking that we in the United States, but also other major countries like Japan, need to start thinking about an alternative global financial system that is not necessarily dependent on the dollar. I think that there's also another major element here, which is that because the U.S. is, as I said, still the strongest individual military power, it's not as dominant as it was before. China has a large and powerful military system. We're seeing the Soviet Union has continued to maintain a fairly strong system, and certainly nuclear weapons. And so if you're the president of the United States right now, and you're looking at the world, and on the one hand, you've got this major problem in the Middle East, and it's not just a problem in the Middle East; it's where the fight is. But now we're seeing that some of the opponents of Israel and of the U.S. are able to effectively blockade shipping through the Red Sea, and so that's having an enormous impact on global trade and on the way the whole global economic system works. So, but President Biden is trying to figure out how to solve that problem in the Middle East. In the meantime, we've just had an election in Taiwan. It's pretty clear that the Taiwanese, the majority of Taiwanese, do not wish to become part of mainland China, and it's very difficult to read what Xi Jinping really wants to do. But it's clear that if she were able to somehow bring Taiwan into the mainland motherland China, he would go down in history as greater than Mao. And I'm sure he very much would like to do that. And he has a major military machine. And whereas the U.S. used to be able to send a couple of aircraft carriers through the Taiwan Strait, we don't do that anymore for the very good reason that the Chinese have the ability to defend. I think this raises a further issue, which is not just an issue between the U.S. and China, but it raises the issue of U.S. allies in the Pacific. So Japan is the major ally, South Korea, Philippines, Australia, Thailand is some kind of an ally. Singapore is not an official ally, but we keep an aircraft carrier strike force in Singapore. And so how the security system will be rearranged and led in the Asia Pacific region, I think, is a major issue that, again, the U.S. but also our allies in Asia need to be thinking seriously about. And because Japan is the major ally, it needs to be thinking the most seriously. And I think that we also have to recognize that all of us, I at least for the last 60 years, have been preaching free trade, but we have to be realistic and we have to recognize that that national security can be undermined by free trade. And we need to be thinking about the combination of national security and the benefits of free trade, but also the benefits of national security as we negotiate new trade agreements or as we think about new structures for how the world trading system should be organized. And finally, let me point to another important and really an issue that really concerns me. And that is that we're going to have a presidential election here in the United States in November. And it's going to be a very divisive election. And what we're seeing in the primary elections that are now taking place is a huge division within the United States. And a huge, from my perspective, a huge misunderstanding among Americans of how their system is supposed to work. I think it's funny, people, on the one hand, people who may support President Biden are concerned that he's too old. I have to laugh because I'm a year older than Biden. I'm also from Delaware, so I've known Biden pretty much all my life. And so when people say Biden is too old, I ask myself, am I too old? And I'm not ready to give up yet. So I'm saying I'm not too old, but I do understand the concern that people have about an older guy like Biden or like me, whether we actually have the stamina and the strength to maintain a presidential schedule. But the flip side is that we have a megalomaniac running on the Republican ticket. And I'm sorry if I offend anyone in the audience, but I have absolutely no respect for Trump. I know Trump personally. I've worked for Trump in the past. You can't believe him. You can't. He's dishonest. He's not. Should not even be considered. In my view, should not even be considered for president. But he has a lot of support, and some of that support reflects flaws and inequality and mismanagement of the American system. And so I think a major factor and an issue that we in the United States need to address, but our allies need to be thinking and helping us as much as possible, is how do we fix these flaws in the American system, and how do we maintain American support for global peace and for global fairness and for global trade going forward. So let me close with that, and I'm happy to take any questions. And thank you very much for being patient and listening to me.
Great, thank you, Clyde. So you have a lot of issue laid out. So I think we have many questions. So please, audience, if you have any question you want to ask for Mr. Prestowitz, please put it onto the Q&A box so that we can pick it up to ask your questions to Clyde. So let me start with the first question. You talked about many concerns and the change of global structure, and you have been witnessing a lot of things with Japan and Japan's in its policy as well as defense policy. And having shared what you think about the U.S. concerns, what do you think Japan's role? What do you expect Japan's to take up a role of? How do you see Japan?
Yeah, no, good question. So on the one hand, I think that Japan is an advanced industrial technological economy, and I'm concerned that Japan's economic growth, of course, has slowed dramatically. I would like to see more economic growth in Japan. But in any case, I think Japan's support and rebuilding of particularly its semiconductor industry, but of other strategic industries, is very important. And I think from my perspective, a positive aspect is that I know that Japan has the ability to do economic development and technological development and to be competitive in leading edge industries. I think it's important for Japan to maximize that capability. Now, I think that inevitably, because China has become militarily so powerful, and because China is continuing to really pour money into its military development, the U.S. needs more military help in the Asia-Pacific region, and Japan is the obvious candidate. And Japan has, of course, moved in that direction. I just think it needs to make more movement in that direction. A critical question is, of course, Korea. Korea U.S. has a mutual security agreement with Korea, as we do with Japan. Korea is not as important as Japan, but Korea-Japanese relationship is important. And so I'm just praying that Korea and Japan can bury the hatchet and maintain a cooperative military relationship. Japan has already taken steps to support the Philippines, and I appreciate that. I think I would like to see Japan do more of that kind of thing. And I think the United States needs to bring its Pacific allies into a more active and more, let's say, a more closely related group. So I could imagine, foresee, and we have NATO in Europe. I could think of a kind of a NATO in Asia with, let's say, Australia, U.S., Japan, Philippines, South Korea, Thailand. The U.S. has a military agreement with Thailand. Singapore is not a formal ally, but as I said, we do maintain an Air Force aircraft carrier attack force in Singapore. And obviously, Taiwan is not a formal ally, but de facto, it is an ally. I think all of that needs to be pulled more closely together and act more strategically in response to China.
Okay, so we have another question from the audience, from Ken. Thank you, Ken. His question is, what is your view today on the criticism that of the anti-globalism crowd? For example, the American elites sold out American workers for their own narrow benefit. I just reviewed the comments of both Bush and B. Clinton on the trips to Japan, and all they talked about was jobs. What do you think about it?
Well, I think that it's a complicated world that we live in. On the one hand, I'm sympathetic to the point that the questioner makes about the sellout of U.S. workers. Let me use Apple as an example. Everything that Apple sells, virtually everything that Apple sells, originated in what's known as the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. So it's an arm of the U.S. Defense Department, which specializes in trying to fund and develop advanced technologies. And so your Apple iPhone and your Apple computer and most of your other Apple things most of it originated in the Defense Advanced Research, what we call DARPA. And for a long time, Apple made these products in the U.S., primarily in California. In fact, I can remember must have been about 1982, I was working at the Commerce Department, and my assistant came rushing in. She was all excited. And she said, Clyde, Steve Jobs is on the line. And I laughed. I said, no, it's Steve, she said. So I picked up the phone, and sure enough, it's Steve Jobs. And Apple has developed a new laptop computer. They want to sell it in Japan. They're having trouble selling it in Japan. And so they want me to try to help them open the Japanese market. So I put together a group of people. We flew out to California. We met with Steve in Cupertino. We met with Steve and his team. And we put together a plan to try to get the new laptop Apple computer into the Japanese market. And we had a bit of success. It never became a runaway bestseller in Japan, but it did begin to sell. Okay, so that was Apple in the 1982, 1983, let's say 1980s. Okay, now fast forward to 1998, and Steve hires a guy named Tim Cook away from Dell to come to Apple. And so Tim goes to Apple to manage manufacturing and distribution. And Tim had been working with Dell in China. So Tim is now at Cupertino with Apple, and he's shocked. He says, "Steve, my God, what are you doing? You're using high price American workers to make these products, and you're paying California taxes, and you have to meet all of these environmental requirements. My God, man, you got to move your stuff to China." And sure enough, that's what Apple did. They moved all their production to China. So today you have the irony that everything that Apple makes came out of the U.S. government R&D. Almost everything Apple makes came out of U.S. government funded research and development. And everything that Apple sells is made in China. You also have another factor, which is that, again, let me tell you a little story. In 2015, there was a shooting in Bakersfield, California, and the shooter dropped his phone. And it happened to be an iPhone. So the FBI got this iPhone and they wanted to open it to see if they could get information that would help them find the shooter. And they went to Apple and they said to Apple, "Can you please help us open this iPhone?" And Apple said, "Absolutely not. No, sirree, Bob. We don't want to in any way, we can't have customers fearing that we might make their personal information available to the US government." Well, long story short, the FBI found another way to open the iPhone, and they solved that case. But no thanks to Apple for solving the case. Okay, now fast forward to 2019, the 2019-2020 period. And kids in Hong Kong are demonstrating against the effort or the movement by Beijing to essentially bring Hong Kong into the mainland Chinese system. And there's an app in the Apple App Store. It's called Hong Kong Map Live. So with that app, you can see Hong Kong in real time. So the kids in Hong Kong have the app and they're looking at Hong Kong and they're saying, "Oh, the police are over here. Oh, good, we'll demonstrate over there." And this was driving the Hong Kong police crazy, and it was driving Beijing crazy. And Beijing let Apple know that they better get rid of that app. And within a very short time, that app was out of the app store. So this raises an interesting question. It's not just a question of are US companies betraying their workers, but the question of is Apple an American company? Is Steve Jobs an American citizen? He says he's an American citizen. He carries an American passport. But actually, in many respects, he's representing China more than he's representing the United States. I think this is, in fact, I just use Steve, I use Apple as an example, but it's the only one example. There are many others. The fact is that, and it's not just the United States, the fact is that free world countries like the United States, particularly the United States, but Japan too, the EU also, are all subject to pressures from authoritarian countries like China, but not just China, Russia, and others, pressures that in a way force their business leaders to operate in ways that are disadvantageous to the home country. I think this is a major issue that the free world needs to be thinking about. And particularly, we need to think about it in terms of the WTO and the trade agreements that we have between authoritarian and free countries. I think it's a major, major issue. And so my view is that there are, in fact, I live mostly in Washington, D.C., and I go listen to hearings in the Congress. And, my perception is that very often the top American business leaders are not only not doing the best thing for their workers, they're not doing the best thing for their country. And I think this is a big issue that we need to address.
Great, thank you. So we have another question from Tanaka-san, Nobuo Tanaka-san.
Tanaka-san, ohayou gozaimasu.
Dear
Konnichiwa.
Clyde, this is Nobuo Tanaka. I remember well about the high-tech working group talking about semiconductor issues. What a change since then. So I propose U.S., Japan, Korea cooperation on building nuclear propulsion submarines, not nuclear bomb, parentheses, as a follow-up of the trilateral Camp David summit. This is Northeast Asian AUKUS. Do you support my idea?
I do, absolutely. In fact, I've joined your group. Put me on the committee. No, I think this is exactly the kind of thing that that we need to be doing a lot more of. Yep.
Okay, and a question we have from the previous in advance from the audience about the Mr. Trump's possibility of getting elected. That I think a lot of not only Japanese but many other people in the world is afraid of if Mr. Trump become a president of U.S. United States. And then what do you see the risks for in the case Mr. Trump has become president of the United States, and what is the Japan? What can Japan, expect? What can Japan to deal with for the new risks that you might see?
Right. Well, I think that I'm hoping that Trump never becomes president, but in the event that he did, I think that in some respects he would be amenable. He would agree to collaborate and cooperate with Japan and with other U.S. allies in terms of what Tanaka-san was talking about just previously. I think that Trump, in fact, would be amenable to collaborative technological projects and would be amenable. Probably Trump would be not just amenable, but he would be strongly pushing the notion of closer relationship between military organizations of all of the free world allies. I think that he would put great emphasis on the need for U.S. allies to increase their military spending. As you know, Japan has been increasing its military spending, but relatively, comparatively, Japan's military spending remains quite low. And the same is true in Europe, Germany, and other European countries have spent and are spending very little compared to what the U.S. and some other major countries are spending. And we're seeing in the case of Ukraine, for example, that the Europeans are beginning to wake up, beginning to increase the amount of their military spending. But it needs to go much further. So I do think that in that respect, I think in a way, Trump would be would have a positive impact in increasing the budgets and the support for strong military organizations. I think that Trump also could be effective in creating some international trade arrangements that might be useful. And what I mean is this. Let me use an example. Back in around 2012, 2013, say 10, 12 years ago, Germany was the major exporter of solar panels. And it was the low-cost producer of solar panels. Germany had always been reluctant to go into nuclear energy. And so it emphasized solar energy, and it took leadership in technology and cost of production of solar panels. And then at a certain point, around 2015, some of you may remember that at that time, China adopted a policy of Made in China 2015. And China had a long list of products, semiconductors and telecommunication, advanced telecommunications and advanced aircraft that were to be made in China by 2015. And one of these products was solar panels. And so what China did was it imposed a tariff on the German panels. So it stopped importing solar panels from Germany, and it began producing solar panels in China, and the Chinese government heavily subsidized the production of those solar panels. Now, there's an aspect of manufacturing that most people are not aware of, but it is very, very, very important. And that is called economies of scale. And what it means is that if you build a factory and you make only one, let's say an automobile factory, let's say Toyota builds a automobile factory and they make only one automobile. That's a very expensive automobile. But if they make 100,000 automobiles in that factory, those are inexpensive. So the more you make, the lower the cost. And so what China did was initially, when it began building solar panels, its costs were high. It wasn't competitive with the German panels. But the government imposed a tariff, so the Germans were kept out, and the Chinese began building more and more panels. And as they built more and more panels, their costs fell. And so today, China is the world's low-cost producer of solar panels. They got there by being heavily subsidized initially. I think today they don't need subsidies because they dominate the global market. So what I'm trying to say is that when the free world countries like Japan, the US, the EU talk about trade, they typically do not think about this aspect of economies of scale. They always hesitate to protect any industry. But the problem is that if you want to be in solar panels, but at the same time you want to have free trade with China, you're not going to have solar panels. So I think there has to be more strategic thinking, not just by the US, but by the entire free trade world, more strategic thinking about how do we actually handle the combination of our security and our desire for free trade.
Okay, thank you. So there's another question from Oliver of Toyota. As you talked about Taiwan, if China may take actions to unite Taiwan into Chinese motherland, and do you see any conceivable way that in the event of China makes a move against Taiwan, Japan could stay out of it?
I'm afraid not. Let me say, let's look at it piece by piece. There have been a lot of war games played by the U.S. Defense Department, trying to think about how to defend Taiwan. And as you well know, U.S. has bases in Japan, Okinawa, and elsewhere in Japan. I have participated myself in some of what they call war games. And in all the war games in which I have participated, one of the aspects of the game is that the Chinese try to destroy the American bases on Okinawa. And so, if, if you imagine that hostilities between Taiwan and mainland China and the U.S. appear to be rapidly approaching, if you imagine that the Chinese want to launch a knockout attack, in order for them to do that, they have to knock out the U.S. bases in Okinawa and elsewhere in the Philippines and in Guam. U.S. has its own bases. So it's very hard to imagine a scenario in which China doesn't hit Japan. It wants to hit the U.S., but it has to hit Japan in order to hit the U.S. Now, I guess you could argue, okay, so Japan could just withdraw from the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, or Japan could somehow arrange to get the U.S. forces out of Okinawa, or out of other parts of Japan. But that seems very unlikely, very unrealistic to me. So if I were Japanese, I think I would assume that if there's going to be a war over Taiwan between China and the U.S., Japan is going to be in it somehow. I'm sorry. I wish I could give you more hope, but actually, I think there's maybe a better way of looking at that question, which is that, first of all, for China to attack Taiwan seems to me self-destructive. Even if let's assume that Beijing would win eventually in a war with Taiwan, but the destruction would be enormous. And just think about one industry. Taiwan's Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC, is the world's leading semiconductor producer, not designer, but producer. And honestly, if I were the president of the United States, and if it looked like China was going to be able to capture TSMC, I would order my Air Force to destroy TSMC in Taiwan. And if I'm Xi Jinping, why would I want to take a chance that all of this high technology that Taiwan has could be destroyed? And so even if Xi Jinping manages to get Taiwan, what does the Taiwan that he gets looks like? And to me, it looks like a huge disaster. So I'm still of the view that Xi and the Chinese Communist Party will hesitate a long time before they launch an attack. And I also think that there are other ways that we could respond without necessarily going to war. For example, people have talked about China might blockade Taiwan, which it could easily do given its large navy. But there's another element here, which is that China itself imports enormous amounts of oil and raw materials and food materials. And all of that, most of that import to China, into China, most of that goes through the Strait of Malacca. The U.S. Navy has the ability to plug up the Strait of Malacca. And so if Xi is thinking of blockading or some other way of trying to gain control of Taiwan, he has to reckon with other strategic moves that might be made by the U.S. and by its allies. So I'm hoping that Xi will be careful, and maybe he'll have a heart attack or something, and it's not over till it's over. So I think we need to keep negotiating and keep our powder dry, but let's not overreact.
Okay. So this is going to be my final question to you. So you talked about the concern within the US too, that paralyzation in the US Congress seems to be one of the major obstacle for any decision that made in the United States. So do you see any way to break this deadlock? Or how do you see this internal domestic deadlock?
Well, we have, the election, we have an election, presidential election coming in November. And I think, that will lead to new actions. We don't know what the new actions will be, but it won't stay frozen. I'm somewhat optimistic. On the one hand, people, as we mentioned earlier, people talk about Biden being too old. But as I said, I'm older than Biden, and I like to think that with age comes some wisdom. And I would make this argument. I do make this argument. People who say Biden's too old, I say, hey, wait a minute. Biden has been in the U.S. Congress or in U.S. politics, either in the Congress or in the White House as vice president, now president, for about 60 years. He really knows how the U.S. political system works. He knows it better than any of the other major figures in the U.S. politics. Moreover, Biden has, because he's been around so long, he knows all of the major world leaders personally. He has negotiated with and met with and eaten dinner with all of the major world leaders. So he has an insight and a knowledge of global affairs that really virtually nobody else in the United States has, or in the world has. And, okay, maybe he trips a little bit when he walks, and maybe he stutters a little bit when he talks. But if I look at other political possible candidates, Trump, it's not even a comparison. Trump has none of that. Or DeSantis, the governor of Florida, very bright guy, but nothing like that experience and knowledge. Newsom, governor of California, again, very bright guy, but not that experience. So I think people should give Biden more credit than they're tending to give him.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, it now looks like Trump is doing very well because he's winning all of these primary elections. But you have to remember that in these elections, only the Republican Party is voting. The Democratic Party is not voting in these Republican primary elections, number one. And number two, while Trump is beating Governor Haley very badly, he's not getting the whole Republican vote. So in a final election, I don't see Trump as necessarily the favorite in the election against Biden. And so I'm keeping my fingers crossed and wishing for the best.
Okay,
Right.
great.
Right.
Hello. How are you?
All right.
Good to
Great.
see you.
Yeah, great to see you. I think this is a very important issue, but I think we have to really continue quite open dialogue, and also in Japanese government and for leadership in Japan too.
Yes, of course.
Right.
Absolutely.
Great. Yeah. This is a big challenge anyway.
Yeah, no, we have to keep fighting.
At any time, whether Japan is ready for it.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maybe one final question is coming from audience.
Yeah.
In addition.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So.
Yeah, one thing is I think really Japanese sort of leadership and everything. I think Japanese people in general are really aware the sort of urgency of certain things may come. how about the role of press and all the things that
Mhm.
I'm raising
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
This-
Well, I think one concern that I do have, you mentioned the role of the press, which is
Yeah.
very important.
Right.
Unfortunately, in the U.S., I'm not sure how this is working in Japan, but in the U.S., the major press, like the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal,
Right.
they're really dying.
Right.
The everybody has mobile phones, and they've got all of this other social media, and all of that is really confusing, I think, a
Yes.
lot of the public. It's a danger, I think.
Right. I'm sure of that. I think we like to just continue sort of this kind of dialogue from outsiders and leaders too.
Yeah. Well, the more we can do, the better.
Yeah.
I'm for
No
that.
question. But I think now you remember Fukushima disaster 13
Yes.
years ago. Do you think Japan really changed that? I'm not.
I hope so.
That's the issue in Japan's issue, in my
Yeah.
view.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Japan also have a domestic issue that we have a
Yeah, of course.
concern,
Everybody
and
does.
so as any other, United States too. So we very much like to thank Clyde Prestowitz today for sharing your view. It was very thought-provoking and very intriguing. So we appreciate that you joined today's discussion, and
Right.
thank you very much.
My
Okay.
pleasure. My
Thank-
pleasure. I look forward to seeing you all. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
You.
With this, we're closing the dialogue session. Thank you very much
Okay,
for
great.
participating.
Yeah.
Thank you.